Where my mixing process begins is in my mix template. Now, if you're not familiar with working with templates, the general idea is that you create a session that's got everything in it that you want, and then you utilize the save as template command or whatever the equivalent is in the workstation that you're working in. There's not a whole lot in my template, but what's there is really important. The heart of it are the effects. So what these are a whole bunch of effect returns. These are all reverbs. Use a lot of UAD reverbs, the 140 plate, the 250 digital reverb, Altiverb, and so on. There's several delays. Then some modulation and doubling effects, the MicroShift, the Roland CE1 chorus, and so on. Down here, the Devil-Loc, okay, which is like a very crunchy, very hard compressor, great for parallel use. And then some additional returns for use with hardware. And I'm going to talk about how hardware integrates into the mixing process later on. All of these effects are grouped together in a summing stack. This makes it really easy to hide and show all of these extra tracks, right? Keep my screen cleaned up. And also, when it comes time to use the effects, a feature I like in Logic is that all of my effect buses are grouped together in effects, which is the name of the summing stack. But so, for example, if I want to use my space echo, I select that, and then notice that here my send is named space, and that's because under the mix menu in Logic, I've gone into the I/O labels and named my buses to match the effect that they're routed to. And again, whether or not you're using Logic, features like this are pretty common in other workstations. The concepts here are more important than the exact features of Logic for the most part. Then there are a few basic interface things. For example, I like to make sure that I'm showing both the bar ruler and then also the time ruler up above. So that's something I've preset in the template. And then you'll also notice that I've created markers 16 bars apart. And these just give me a starting point, right, so that I have an easy way. I can use the go to next marker command just when I'm first setting up the mix to rapidly move back and forth. And honestly, sometimes I move these into place to match the sections, and sometimes I just use them as a handy fast forward and rewind command. The one track I've got in here for the drum loop is just because as I work on the template, sometimes I open up my template and I add or remove things. It's handy to have some audio there so that as I'm testing something out, the monitor and print tracks have to do with the fact that I'm summing using an external summing amplifier. We're going to talk more about the hardware side of things later, but suffice to say, monitor is an audio track on which we listen to the audio coming back from my summing amplifier, and then the audio leaves the monitor track and goes into the print track for me to actually record the final mix. The reason this is done with 2 tracks instead of 1 is just in case I want to insert plugins on the final 2-channel mix after I've hit all my hardware processors. So once we've opened up the template, it's time to import the audio. Here's all the audio that was exported from live, and it all comes in. Every group track, every individual track, whether or not I'm using them, they all come in. There's a use existing audio tracks or create new tracks option. In this case, it doesn't matter because there are no tracks, so it's going to create new tracks either way. The next step is just to get everything organized, right? Some of this is arbitrary. It's just how I like things organized. And then I go through and I color code the tracks and the regions in those tracks just to make everything pop visually. And then I'm going to start creating some routings. In this mix, I've used summing stacks heavily. A summing stack makes it easy for me to show or hide the tracks in the stack. It also routes the audio from all three, in this case, of the tracks into the stack, giving me one place to apply processing, to adjust the volume, and so forth. Let's take a look at what this logic file looks like once everything's organized. So this is the drum group, very simple. We've got some clap and some kick. All of the other drums in this song are hand percussion, which are all in this group named after the percussionist, Dave Sharma. Both of these summing stacks are routed into a group called all drum. I'm taking the output of both my drums and my hand percussion and I'm sending them all out to a pair of analog processors. And so this all drum is how I sum them together before sending them out of the computer. Creating this sort of routing is easy. I'm going to select the drum stack and the hand percussion stack, and instead of routing them to an output on my audio interface, I'm going to send them to an unused bus. In Logic, this automatically creates an aux return over here at the right. I'm going to rename it real quick. When this aux return is created, it only shows up in the Logic mixer. Now this varies from workstation to workstation, so you may not have to do this step. But in Logic, if we want it to show up in the main arrangement window and we want to be able to drag it to a different location in the order of tracks, we have to right-click on it and create track. As soon as I use this command, it pops up in the main window, and now I can drag it into place. Now the audio from both of these stacks flows in to this aux return. Now let's take a look at the bass group, which has some interesting things going on inside of it. So we've got our bass sounds, as we would expect, but then I've also moved in a couple of things from the drum group. Timpani, low-pitched percussion that are happening while there's a whole bunch of other low end going on. So these I really want to consider as part of the bass. Also notice that I've got a reverb return in here, because as we mentioned in part 1, this heavy reverb on this bassy pad sound is really part of the sound. So that doesn't belong in my effect returns. That just belongs right here with the bass sounds. Notice that I've left them their original color. That lets me know where they came from, which is useful later in the process, because sometimes the process of back and forth with the client can get a little bit confusing. If they reference things according to how they grouped them and organized them, it's very helpful to be able to quickly look and know, oh, okay, they're talking about this, I moved it, but I can see without going to my notes exactly what's happening. The mids group is something that I found increasingly handy, especially when working with electronic music that doesn't conform to conventional orchestrations. In other words, there's a whole bunch of sounds coming in and out that are synths and that are, in this case actually, there's a bunch of live violins played. It's not conforming to existing ideas about what goes on in the mid-range. For example, you might have a guitar group and a keyboards group in a song. Well, it's just all mid-rangey sounds. And I'm putting them all together because it makes them easier to process, right? So for example, when there's a lot of mids going on in the middle of the song, they're all hitting a compressor that's going to clamp down on the peaks and keep that mid-range energy under control. It also gives me the opportunity to EQ. The mids can overwhelm the vocals. If I discover that's happening, I may just want to put an EQ tweak to carve out a little space on the mids overall, very fast and easy. Inside the mids summing stack, I actually have two subgroups. So I've taken all of the synthesizers, okay, and sent them to a synth bus, and then I've taken all of the violins and sent them to a violin bus, and then in turn, the output of these two buses is the summing stack in the mids. The effects stack is where all of the sound effects are. Now in music like this, the sound effects are really important, but at the beginning of the process, these get muted because they're just too distracting and they don't help me solve the really important problems of how are the vocals and the mid-range synth sitting together? How are the kick and the bass sitting together? I get all of that stuff in place before I even try to mix these guys in. So that just stays muted for now. Here are those effect returns that I exported from live. Okay, and as expected, I'm not using most of them. Again, they're very handy to have here because I can hear what the original vocal reverb sounded like, right? I can refer to things if I'm trying to get an idea when I'm listening to the rough mix of what's going on, but for the most of the time, they just stay muted. Some of them, however, are very important, delay tails, things that really pop out in the mix. But just like the sound effects, initially when I'm working on the mix, all of the entire return stack stays muted because I just don't want to get distracted by all of those additional sounds, and I really just want to focus on the fundamentals. When we first imported the tracks, I mentioned that everything gets brought in, whether or not I'm using it, and everything gets organized. That's to make it really handy for me to check things or to change strategies as I go. And the way that I organize all of these things that I'm not using is by hiding them. Okay, so Logic has a hide view. Again, most workstations have some equivalent of this feature. So notice that right next to my drum stack, I have the output of the drums group from live. Now, because I'm not using it, I've hidden it, I've turned the track off, and in many cases, I also mute the clip itself. Now, that might seem like overkill, but the moral of the story here is that you never want to take something out of a mix that you're really not using just by muting it. Okay, that's because there's at least one command in Logic and in most other sequencers that will unmute all tracks. And what you don't want to end up with is hearing something that's hidden that's not supposed to be there. The reason that I keep all of these additional tracks around is sometimes for just a point of reference. For example, if I want to check out something that was going on in the rough mix, I can listen to the group and hear what's going on. We also mentioned that there are cases where I will actually use the output of a group in the final mix. If I get into the process, however, and discover that that group really isn't working, well, then I've got all of my underlying tracks already in there and ready to go. I just need to unhide them, turn them on, and I can switch strategies without having to go back into import and organization mode. Also notice that I've created a couple of additional tracks down here at the bottom that I probably should add to my template. One is for the rough mix, and one is for my most recent mix. Both of them stay muted, and if I ever need to hear them, I hit the solo switch. The rough mix is just here so that I can refer to it as needed. Once I'm at this point in the process, I don't spend a lot of time listening to it, but it is occasionally really handy to let me know what sort of balances the artists were originally hearing. As I go through the process and I revise the mix, it's really handy for me to have the previous mix handy to listen to as well. Sometimes for a very simple reason that I'm just concerned that I may have messed something up, that I bumped a knob on one of my analog processors. Fortunately, that doesn't usually happen, but there are times when I just want to go back and hear if I've changed something for the better or if I've accidentally made a mistake. So this is a very handy workflow thing. Okay, so it may seem that we're spending a lot of time analyzing and setting things up, but I've found that this is an absolutely critical part of the process. When you're mixing, you don't want to be getting confused about stuff. You don't want to be using any part of your brain to think about anything other than the music. So we're ready to get started on that.